I had a run of arguments so far, and basically in terms of different aspects of the notion of power and authority. They appear to be discrete, but they are not discrete. I mean, up to this point of time, it has been a single run of argument. Power and authority understood as phenomena. Now, all phenomena demand explanation. That would mean they become theorized. So, now we go over to a specification of a large number of theories which have developed around power and authority. To give you a preview, we do not suggest that at the point we stop today's lecture would also be the final point in the evolution of the notion of power and authority or formulation of a theory. For example, when I was a student, I had no idea of Michel Foucault, because there is no Michel Foucault. That would mean successively stalwarts, political philosophers, thinkers, they emerge and they suddenly skew the analysis so far in a particular direction. So, the theories listed today do not mean they are the ultimate theories, but one thing is for certain, that each next theory has emerged as a reaction to each previous theory. This is normally called the cumulative dialectical growth in theoretical thinking, and no later theoretician can be oblivious of what the previous theoreticians have already offered. Seen in this light, we now propose to turn to the theories. The theories come in clusters, but then once again to warn you, and this warning is very important to bear in mind, that these clusters actually combine and recombine. That is, they fertilize themselves, so that there can be another, at least seemingly new kind of theory. Let me give this example. There was a Marx and his compatriot Engels, who provided a theory since then known as the Marxian theory. But then people believing in their line of logic, they have added and extended. We shift from the notion of the Marxian theory to the notion of the Marxist theory, and there is some difference, because the Marxists are Marxians, but the Marxists actually add to the core idea formulated by Marx and Engels. Likewise, we talk about the neo-Marxists, which means each theory is refreshed by the coming into the scene of a man who accepts the core of the argument, but enriches it by additional logic, additional concept, additional force of the argument. All the theories must be understood in terms of their continuous dynamic growth. This is something you must remember as you listen to a very essentialist rendering of the major theoretical positions. The first cluster will be called the liberal theory, but there must be a question that why it is the first cluster and why it is not the second cluster. This is a very interesting question, because theories have their histories also, and as a teacher, as a speaker, as a learner, I can't normally disturb the sequence in which they appeared. It so happens that they appeared first as a clutch of what became known as liberal theories. The historical context of the formation of liberal theory is obviously the rise of a new ruling class called the bourgeoisie after the collapse of European feudalism. That was the moment when Europe was breaking out of authoritarian frame. Because authoritarian and liberal are antonyms, the theories which arose at the breakdown of the authoritarian systems of feudalism came automatically to be known as the liberal theory. Its celebrated principle is this, that individual should enjoy freedom. It has been a major theory. We have variants of liberal theory. We talk about the distortions of liberal theory, but even then liberal theory continues to flourish. I will mention 1, 2, 3 at most of those who contributed to the formulation of classical liberal theory. Let me tell you that when I say the formation of classical liberal theory, I drop a hint that there has been extensions, but the basic foundation was laid by this particular classical liberal theoretical position. The man to begin with, I have already named him, Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, at a more popular level, is famous for his theory of state of nature. I will explain briefly what he meant by state of nature, not because I want to describe it, but because to signal that a new round of theoretical thinking regarding power came up, in which power became a sociological category, no longer a juristic category, that is, no longer a category in law. It became a category as a philosophical position. This is very vital to understand. The degree of sociologicalness of these liberal positions may vary, but for once there was a breaking out of the, let us say, the Austinian frame after John Austin, the famous theorist of sovereignty, who look at power only as the power which is legal and corporeal. It was soon discovered that this is insufficient in order to understand all our experiences of power. Thomas Hobbes had a notion of man essentially as a self-seeker. You may please concede that if you talk about an Adam Smith in economics, or you talk about the currently fashionable neoliberal economic theory, it still remains the cardinal observation that individuals are self-seekers. What do they seek? They seek gratification of their interests. What are their interests? Some interests pertain to their body, food, shelter, sexuality, reproduction. Some relate to their superorganic existence, like need for culture. We are interest-driven individuals, and if resources for gratification are scarce, then the normal tendency among us would be to fight each other. That way, to quote Hobbes, life would become nasty, brutish and short, because everybody would be running after everybody to actually prevent somebody to enjoy a resource which is scarce. Hobbes wanted the formation of an authority, a center of power, which will put an end to a civil war prone society, metaphorically the state of nature. And he fell back on mythology actually to create a category called the Leviathan. The Leviathan would be the source of authoritarian power according to Hobbes. Why? Without absolute power, collective living would be indispensable. This is the beginning of allotting to power a social function, and all the specifications of theories which will now follow, they harp on the same thing, that power has a social function. That is why I raised the question, power is what power does. According to the liberal theory, then power, particularly the power of the state, is indispensable for the maintenance of a civil order. This clue was taken over by the two other thinkers famous for social contract theory, for example, Locke and Rousseau. Everybody believed that there must be what Locke called a common superior authority controlling individuals seeking their own interest, or for Locke, to protect the property of the individual. For Rousseau, the freedom of the person. Everybody was actually locating, pinpointing that power and authority, and particularly of the state, would have a vital social function to fulfill. That was also the beginning of the notion of legitimacy. In fact, to go back to Hobbes, Leviathan would be the absolute authority, and Hobbes should say it was legitimate, because only such kind of power can prevent a civil war. So, everybody would have an argument for even the absolute authority enjoyed by a particular center of power and authority, and this particular style of reasoning began with Hobbes, continued by Locke, endorsed by Rousseau, and that became the first major block of what we normally call the liberal theory. The second round of additions began with a man called Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, famous for his famous observation, the greatest good of the greatest number. And to secure the greatest good of the greatest number, there must be state power, as Bentham felt. This line has not been abandoned by anybody at all. With the onset of sociology, 1840-1920, with Durkheim and Max Weber, this social function of power and authority became much more pronounced. For Durkheim, state is a necessary institution to free individuals from the tyranny of the groups, which means state alone would provide the individuals their freedom, and without state, Durkheim would argue that there would be no social order which is founded on a secular moral order. I harp on the word secular moral order because with the collapse of feudalism, religion could not continue to be the foundation of social order. There had to be the reconstitution of the moral basis of society, and for Durkheim that was the role the state would perform. Weber had a larger involvement with the notion of power and authority. I have hinted already that he focused on authority, and I can now add he focused on bureaucracy also as a particular type of authority, and Max Weber said that no society can do without domination. So much so, he defined the state as an institution which enjoys the monopoly of physical violence. I again emphasize on the word monopoly to point out that according to Weber, there would be no contender of the state. State alone would be permitted to be violent vis-a-vis their citizens. That is a very interesting development, and as we progress unto Michel Foucault, we will discover how bits of these theories are actually taken over by Michel Foucault, say for a particular master theory of why power and authority becomes more modern and postmodern. To this we will turn. But between the liberal theory and the Foucauldian theory, two other blocks of theories intervened. One is the Marxian theory and the other is the elite theory. And what is interesting, that the Marxian theory arose as a critical dialectical response to liberal theory, and even today Marxist theory happens to be such. This Marxist theory shares with liberal theory the sociological temper. It is not different, but the unit changes. In liberal theory, the unit would be the individual. In Marxian theory, the unit changes into the class, the ruling class and the subject class. And in Marxist formulation, the state is actually the manifestation of the power of the ruling class in the interest of capital accumulation, power over the subject class, the laboring poor, or as you would say, the proletarian class and the common people. So, for Marx, the understanding is clear that power, the power of the state, is essential for a capitalist society, for it has a social function, the social function A of helping capital increase and B of keeping the dissenters at bay. That way, Marx located the state as an instrument of class domination, always appropriated by the ruling class. See, we actually are poised for taking a look at theories beyond the liberal theory. And since I have already talked about dialectical growth, the next reference has to be the Marxian theory, because the Marxian theory became a major critique of the liberal theoretical position. But then even Marxism triggered a new round of standpoint theories in which no longer class was the take-off point, gender became the take-off point, or ethnicity became the taken point. That way we say a continuous expansion in the ambit of critiques of liberal theory. The Marxian theory again influenced and conditioned both in neo-Marxian direction and in the direction of elite theory. The neo-Marxian direction would actually be in continuation with the fundamentals of Marxism, but in the writings of Gramsci and Althusser, culture became increasingly recognized as a very important factor, something allegedly Marx actually attributed no power at all. Much more interesting in the context of the Marxian theory would be the rise of the elite theory, particularly through the writings of Vilfredo Pareto. Our next round of lecture will focus on the elite theory. Any discussion on power and authority you have just now argued must involve specification of the vital resources for power, because without the resources power is inconceivable, and we have identified a number of resources beginning from body to mind, from sheer physical strength to cultural capital, and we have statutorily pointed out that these sources actually reinforce each other. With this grounding, we started wondering how theories have formed around this experience of power and authority, and since it has been from time immemorial, theoretical thinking has also a very old history. What he did and what he proposed to do in our next lectures also is actually, rather than go through the whole of history of theories on power, we locate the benchmarks, and the first benchmark would be the liberal theory, particularly because the formation of the liberal theory coincided with the rise of a new class, with the death of feudalism, with the emergence of capitalist liberalism. That's how liberal theory acquired a place of prominence. But this theory, focused on individual, actually triggered off an alternative kind of thinking which came from the writings of Marx and Engels, and they began to focus on class, particularly two types of classes, the ruling class and the subject class, or the owning class and the laboring class. This hint that there can be a specific group in charge of power or victim of power actually led to another round of thinking taken over by feminists, black scholars, Dalit scholars, those who now take a cue from Marx to argue that power has never been universal, power has been appropriated by those who are powerful for whatever reasons at a particular historical moment.